Won't you join me?
Light up the sky.
I could have danced
Hello, everyone, and welcome to That Old Gay Classic Cinema. I'm your host, Chris, and we are joined by Nathaniel, my co-host, and my best friend, Ashley Lopez, to discuss one of our favorite pivotal films, Gone with the Wind.
Hey, how exciting. Hello, everyone.
God, so exciting. So, Ashley, we always like to open up the floor to our guests and ask, what is your relationship with cinema or classic cinema in general?
Ooh, good question. First off, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. I'm very excited to be on here. My relationship to cinema or classic cinema. So probably starts from when I was younger, and I can't pinpoint a specific film or age where it just kind of became like light bulb moment. But it just was something that was always there, and obviously always like a comfort depending on your mood or what was going on. Definitely heavily influenced by my father, for sure. Not only because he loves history, and so that was also shared with me through films and other kind of mediums, but also because he really had a good array of different types of films at different points of the timeline. So it wasn't just like whatever the newest film was at that time. It also spans back to different types of movies with different backgrounds. He even has some foreign films. So I always picked from his library. So that's how I was first introduced to it. Obviously, going to the movies also is a regular habit with friends and family. But definitely that's what first got me interested in it, was within his library, which most of it were action historical war movies, but there was some nicer different types of films sprinkled in. And my mom specifically always had a love for Gone with the Wind. So that was actually introduced to me probably before it should have been, but but it was something that I grew up watching. She grew up watching it as well. So like, I think a lot of whatever my parents loved growing up, especially them growing up in like the 50s and 60s, that was passed down from them to me. And so I never really knew that was kind of rare when I grew up, that most people were like, oh, you're watching old movies. I was like, but they're good. And Old Yeller particularly stands out to me, and I don't know why, but I definitely obsessed with that movie when I was growing up. So tragic, though.
Very tragic. No, Ma. Yeller's my dog. I'll do it.
I always think of that Friends scene when Phoebe hasn't seen the ending of Old Yeller. And,
that's always nice when, like, I feel like classic cinema, like, this is like an area that brings families together because it's like kind of across the generations, and there will come a point in time in which the movies that we went to go see at the theater will probably be considered classic cinema, believe it or not. And then That'll be a
That's
weird
something to
transition when
think
that
about.
Yeah, I'm
starts to
not ready for
happen.
that.
I'm still recovering from when someone online said, like, oh, I got this vintage thing from the early 90s. And I was like, oh my God, I broke a hip. I'm like, nope, not ready for that yet. So, but yeah, so it sounds like for you, Ashley, like classic cinema was really just one of the ways that you could connect to your parents, and like you were able to share these things with them, and you got to see the things that brought them joy as children and growing up, and they got to kind of have that exciting moment of introducing it to you. So that's wonderful. That's lovely.
Definitely, especially with both my parents, but more specifically, I know I talked about my dad introducing it to me, but for my mom, it was a way for us to bond because she didn't growing up, and I know Christian, you know this, but growing up, she didn't have the same level of education as me. So it wasn't something where like I grew up with my father telling me stories or creating stories together, reading to me, but with her, she couldn't share that with me. So she would jump in and watch movies with me. And that's how she would kind of pass down teachings, pass down advice, or just have fun without having to contextualize it using like books or from reading from things.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that your parents had introduced you to Gone with the Wind. Was that your mom, your dad, both of them?
My mom, for sure. Definitely less of, he's not a romance type of connoisseur. From a history standpoint, if there had been no romance and just about the Civil War, definitely would have covered it.
Gotcha, good. Chris, how did you become affiliated with Gone with the Wind? What's your connection with the movie?
That's a very interesting story to tell because it was actually when I was very, very young, and we went to a family party, and I was the one who was designated to put all the coats in, our coats in the room, wherever the room was to put the coats in. And I saw that one of my family members had a TV stand, and on the sides there were these VHS films. So I go through them. I'm like, okay, let's see what this person has, because whenever I see films, it's like, oh, that's interesting to me. So I remember I was just scanning through them, and I remember seeing this huge font on the side letter, and that's like Gone with the Wind. I'm like, what is this supposed to be? So I take it out, and on the front cover I see Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable, and then at the very bottom I see Vivien Leigh running across the lawn in her billowing dress. I'm like, this is interesting. I would like to know more about this film. And then years pass, and I never think about that film ever again until my senior or junior year of high school. And I remember that TCM, Turner Classic Movies, was giving a showing at 8:00 at night. So I recorded it. And then the next night I sat down and I watched the entire thing for 3 hours. And I don't know where the time went, because from the opening notes of the overture, I was just enthralled. Yeah.
Very cool. It is a very theatrical experience, especially with like the overture and the intermission, and it really does kind of set the scene for the scope of the movie, I find. So awesome. I came to it much later, I feel like. I had like obviously heard it referenced in popular culture because I feel like there's just like certain lines from the movie that always get quoted. But I became affiliated with it when I was a sophomore in high school, because the book was on the summer reading list, because the focus of that year, I believe, was American literature. So like I like had heard the title and I was like, oh, like there's the movie and the movie's really famous, so maybe I'll read the book and then I'll watch the movie. And I did, and I read the book, and then I definitely watched it. I think it was with my dad for the first time I saw it, because he's usually on board when I want to watch an older movie. So I saw the movie, and again, it was just the scope of it that surprised me. Like, again, it being 4 hours long, and then really kind of this kind of this epic story. And I know that when we were talking and preparing for the episode, we were talking about how this is a kind of like one of the contenders, I think, for what we would consider the American epic. Just because of its length, just because of its scope and the time frame it covers in the movie and in the book especially. So, so I came to it at that point, and I think I was just blown away by the filmmaking of it. Like, it really is a quality piece of technical filmmaking. So that's my connection to it. That's how I came along to it.
What were your guys's? I'm turning the tables and asking you questions. I guess what were your first impressions from what you can remember of the different times that you first were introduced, or maybe first really understood it? Because I know, like, for me watching it at such a young age, obviously the societal problems and even problems with the war just kind of glazed over me because it just wasn't something that I could receive at that age. So just costumes, color, music, that was kind of my first impressions. It wasn't until I got older and watched it and absorbed it where I understood the deeper layers that there were to it.
So I think I was a little bit more aware because I was older when I saw it, and my background, like, I'm white, I'm a northerner, a Yankee, as they would probably call me in the movie. So a lot of the cultural aspects of it were very shocking to me, especially as I was reading the book and watching the film, and I was like, oh, like, this is odd. It's odd to see slavery depicted in this way in a film. It's odd to see, like, again, just the way that it kind of tackles the race issue at the time, and also just the Southern culture, and very kind of counteractive to the view of the Civil War that I had been raised with. Because again, like, I'm in the North, so Civil War is always kind of painted as like, well, Southerners were upset that they were trying to come for slavery and making it illegal, so that's why they decided to secede. And it was always kind of very painted black and white of like, this was wrong, however, they were in the wrong and they tried to leave, and kind of getting cast as like the villains of the war, or like kind of, again, like they were in the wrong because also like the North won, the Union won. So this was kind of my first exposure to like this other kind of perspective of it for me. And so like that was always kind of very clear to me, and just obviously presencing that was my experience with it. Chris, what about you? When did you kind of become aware of the full scope of it?
Well, it wasn't until I was much older again that I really wasn't fully comprehending what I was watching at that time. I just knew that I was just very, very taken with the whole scope of the film itself. I remember feeling, when I first watched, I remember feeling very enthralled by it. I really wasn't sure what was happening, but at the same time, I wanted to be a part of that film. I wanted to be a part of the knowledge of knowing what the techniques were into how the actors did what they did, how the score was set up, how the score was made, what were the reactions of test audiences before this whole before the film ever was released nationwide. And it wasn't until much later that I got the special edition pack of the film that I actually went in and I dug into the 2-hour-long making of narrated by Christopher Plummer, the whole 9 yards of understanding what goes into making a film of this precedence. But watching this film again, as I did a few days ago and last week, it brought to mind a lot of knowledge that we have now as an audience and what we can take away from it and how that can transfer into a queer lens in a way. I've really found the story of Scarlet captivating. I found their depiction of slavery very fairy tale-esque, because it doesn't seem like they're really taking the slavery issue seriously. They just seem like they're like nannies in a way. It's like you don't have them chained up to chattel. You don't have them being beaten and whipped head to toe. It's a very like fairy tale-esque. It's very, there's no other word for it. It's cinematic. And they just wanted their audience to escape in it and not question what they were trying to portray in that film.
Yeah. And there's a reason too that I noticed this because I rented to watch the film on Amazon, and they've added a slide at the beginning of the movie of just like the heads up, like this film is a product of its time. It is based on kind of the attitudes people had at this point in history. We want to make sure that we are preserving cinema. Like, we are going to show this as it was originally presented, and we're also going to be mindful of the context in which this was created. And it's like you said, Chris, like this is a very much a fantasy version of the South, because we also have to remember this was written by a white woman from the South who was basing this kind of on stories that her grandmother was telling her. So again, it's going to be a very specific experience, and it's also going to maybe be a more sanitized one. Although I would argue that the book is definitely darker than the movie in a lot of aspects. And the movie actually kind of sanitized it a little bit more, I think, to make it more palatable for audiences. But I want to go back to your point about it being kind of a queer story, Chris. So I think we've all kind of identified that the story of Scarlet, like, we can look at it through a queer lens. So I guess I want to turn it over to you two. Tell me a little bit about how you feel the queer narrative kind of fits into Scarlet's story.
I think because she, especially with the context of the war, like, so she's portrayed in different aspects, because you know how the film is like segmented for different parts of the time frame that it's covering. She's portrayed like almost 110% per each sector differently, with different like feminine, masculine, having to adopt both or put one aside for the other, depending on whatever the task at hand is. And through that, obviously, you see her character development, though she's not, perfect by the end of it, but has come a long way. But part of that not only being survival mode, but I think some of it you could attest to it just being part of her personality, and maybe the time in which the movie progressed, it was more acceptable, or she was allowed to kind of put that out there without having societal restrictions or restrictions on she's in a feminine glass box, right? So I thought what was interesting, which I didn't realize before I watched it, when I watched it with this lens kind of like on, I think there were things that came out like more so in the beginning, because I always feel like sometimes the beginning kind of is just glazed over the film, and then a lot of it is devoted to developing like the war and then reconstruction. But I feel like I never really paid attention or gave much thought to things that were spoken, the script, or like characters, how they were pre-war. And I noticed for her, highly feminine, they always refer to her as a girl, not a woman at that age. But then it was, pushed on her to have to get married, and that was the only part of it. She's got this great feminine big ball gown that she's got to walk around in. And then they were taking naps like children. Like the girls were taking naps upstairs while the guys were talking about the war. But she sneaks downstairs ultimately to get Ashley's attention. But she's overhearing all of their thoughts and opinions. And it's very clear in the beginning of the film, she's got her own. She's just very careful of what she says and who she's around. So she's like never really feels comfortable to be her true self, and just has to stay by societal norms at that time until the war changed all of that. And then she has to adopt, she adopts more masculine attributes, but she still keeps her femininity. So I think in that sense, she's like very fluid in weaving both, even into the same scene. She weaves both attributes, like the way she talks to Rhett, not ladylike at all. And he even comments on that. And so she becomes like more assertive and aggressive, almost more masculine. But, she doesn't have to fit into one or the other. she's able to maintain kind of both by the end of it. And that's just part of her personality. I don't think it would have developed in that sense had the war not started and kind of changed all of those societal attributes and norms, what was accepted. So I feel like that's very similar behavior that a lot of people in a lot of different perspectives have, whether it's like cultural or ethnic or queer or anything like that of that sort. Definitely there's always societal norms that come into play where you feel restricted or that you have to pick a box, period, to stay in.
Yeah. And people really do like to put Scarlett into a box, especially in the beginning. And she definitely is trying to carve her own way in the world. And she's not dumb. She might be a little naive, but she's not dumb. And she understands the power that she has. And also, like, for context, she's a 16-year-old at the beginning of the movie. Like, she's supposed to be 16 years old. So kind of just becoming a young adult in this very hierarchical world. I definitely butchered that, but y'all know what I'm talking about, where it's like, obviously, not only do you have white folks and black folks occupying very different segments of society, but even amongst the individual groups themselves, there's even further divisions. Like, you have Mammy talking about field hands versus house workers. You have again, Mammy too, she's kind of the main one to kind of call out the Slatteries as white trash. The Yankees, the Southerners. There is all of these groups that are existing, and Scarlett is obviously trying to be put into this box of the Southern Belle, the perfect Southern Belle, who is modest but also knows how to flirt. And you can see that she's rejecting some of that modesty in the beginning when she wants to wear the dress to the barbecue that shows her shoulders, shows her bosom, and all of the other women are covered from head to toe. She's the only one who you can see any sort of skin because she's wearing an evening gown, but wearing it in the afternoon. So kind of testing that. And I think she fits into kind of this being like the queer aspect of this story, I think, is ultimately her chasing after something that isn't actually going to make her happy. And for every queer person, I feel like there is that experience at one point in your life or another where you're trying to chase this idealized version of your life that other people may have wanted for you. Whether that be, again, like getting married, having the 2.5 kids, and obviously you're doing that with someone who is the opposite sex as you. And that's what she's doing through this whole movie. She's chasing after Ashley Wilkes, and people keep telling her, like, he's not going to make you happy. He's not going to make you happy. But she's really dead set on trying to make this happen. So I think it's especially this closeted queer experience of not wanting to accept what actually would make you happy. And for all intents and purposes, I don't think she would have been fully happy with Rhett Butler, but that'll come up later on as we talk about kind of the later scenes in the movie. But yeah, I think that's kind of the queer experience for me, is really Scarlett's chasing something that she thinks will make her happy, but then doesn't make her happy. Chris, what about you? Where do you kind of see the queer lens for this film, especially through Scarlett?
Well, given that this film takes place many in different sequential years throughout Scarlett's life, you start it when she's young and then you end it. We're not really sure how old she is, but we're supposed to be
I think it's 10 years. So like she's like 26, 28 at the end.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because it'd be like 4 for the war, I think.
Mm-hmm.
At least.
Right. So during those times, you see her kind of somewhat growing, but at the same time still trying to keep her childlike innocence. In a way, there are many instances where she's behaving like a child when she marries her first husband, and then she has to cry at her own wedding party, like, oh my God, why is this happening to me? I wanted to marry Ashley. And then her second husband is Frank Kennedy, who she stole from her sister because she just wanted money. She wanted security. She wanted to feel a part of society when society was dwindling during that time, and she wanted to revitalize it with the lumber mill industry. And then her last and final husband, Rhett Butler, I wasn't sure where she was going with him, but she just wanted another sense of security to feel wanted. And that's what I think every queer person wants, in a way, to feel accepted, to feel wanted, to feel as if they matter to somebody else. And this film does a beautiful portrayal of seeing how far you can take it, how far it can take you down a certain road. And with Scarlett, she just goes down many different roads. It's a great example when she goes to Ashley's birthday party in that red dress, and that whole scene of looking like, yeah, I'm here. What do you think about me now? Like, that whole scene, I was watching it last night and I said, you know what? This is a very important queer element, because you can see how she's not taking shit from nobody. She's just there just to be the disaster part of the party. Like, she's like, yeah, you thought you could belittle me down, make fun of me. I'll show them what's what. And at first she was very upset about Rhett leaving her. She's like, no. Rhett's like, no, you made this mess yourself. You're going to fix it up. You're going to play the part. And I think that's what the queer element that I find so riveting is that throughout time, throughout all of our lives, some of us are forced to wear masks that in some aspects we're not able to show people. We're not able to fully show ourselves to fully show ourselves as. We have to put on a front. We have to make people think that we don't care. We have to make people think that, oh, you don't matter to me, but I'm not going to let you see that. I'm going to let you see another side of me. There's no aspect of showing your true self. And that's what Scarlett, I believe that's the whole aspect of Scarlett's whole character arc, is to make the audience think that we're not supposed to care what she thinks. She's reflecting on what everybody else thinks about her at every given moment of the time during her life.
Because I think ultimately Scarlett her story is one of survival and having to adapt and having to camouflage in order to be able to survive. And like early in the movie, after her first husband dies and she's in mourning and she's like, I don't want to pretend. I'm tired of pretending. And she's having that
air quotes for mourning.
Yeah, big air quotes for mourning. Yeah. She's upset that she has to wear black. That she's mourning her loss of color. And she's just so tired of pretending, and she's just so emotional about it. And she has to pretend because she has to still survive in this society. And there's just so many aspects of this story. Like this really, like, I think watching it now as like kind of like a more fully formed adult, and just knowing what I know about trauma, every move that Scarlett makes in this movie makes perfect sense. Everything she does, every decision she makes, it really is the mindset of someone who has experienced trauma and has to survive after that trauma has occurred. Because she has lost everything. She has lost her house. She has lost her family as they once were. Her father's checked out. Her mother is dead. She has to rebuild after this. And again, presencing that she is a white woman who literally owns people. Like, she's not doing this by herself. She has people around her who are also helping her do that. It is still someone who is trying to survive in the way that they know how. And as a woman during that time, I'm reminded of Little Women, Florence Pugh, in the most recent adaptation, her speech to Laurie about, I am a woman, marriage is absolutely a business proposition. This is not about love. I need to survive. I need to eat, because whatever I get becomes my husband's. So I can't mess this up. So yeah, I am going to marry Mr. Kennedy because I can get access to his store. And I'm smart enough to run it. And I can do it. And I know I can't do it without a man. Otherwise, I get ostracized like Belle Watling. because Belle is that ultimate quintessential of what happens if you go too far outside the norm. And Scarlet could have easily become Belle under different circumstances. So it really is, her story is one of survival. And I'm not saying that she's doing this in a healthy way or an effective way. She's doing it to survive, though. And that's the rationale we have to look at her through all of the choices she's making.
It's funny that you mentioned Belle Watling, because I wanted to shed a light on her for a minute, because as I was watching this film again, there's just so much that you can take away from her character, especially in a queer aspect, in a queer lens. When you look at when we're first introduced to her, she's in this big taffeta pink outfit, and it just reminds me a little bit of Glinda, in a way.
I do get Glinda vibes from her. I don't know if it's the color of her hair or the pink, or like I get some
outfits. It's very big, it's very bold, it's very, here I am, look at me, I don't give a fuck what you think about me, think what you want, I'm not going anywhere. And at the end of the film, when we see Rhett in seclusion and he goes to her for a consolement, after he leaves, you could see tears streaming down her face, because you know that she's put her child in front of herself for a few times, but at the same time she's trying to bolster herself up while trying to maintain that relationship with her child. And she understands what it's like to lose a child, and she's lost her child in a way, but she's also trying to, I believe, she has an arc where she would like to reconnect with her child and just say, let's try to make this work. There's just so many aspects of this film that you can just break away, which I kind of want to do. But
I feel like Ashley's another one too, because his attitudes, his opinions, though he's not afraid to say them, he does seem a little, not shy, but like reserved in that like cautious survivor sense of like, maybe I know the right people that I can mention a little bit of this to, but I know I can't go so far. So like the scene I mentioned that Scarlett's eavesdropping, when all the men are talking about the impending war, and like most of them are very excited and like they want to get out there, they want to blow stuff up, they want to kill, and they think it's going to be over very quickly. Obviously he's of the most uncommon opposite opinion of, I don't really think that that's probably a smart game plan, and hopefully it doesn't come to that. And he's not mentioning anything that is outrageous, because most of us in a modern sense would say, yeah, that's a normal rationale, I would feel the same. But to them, they, at one point, one of them, I think it was Charles, he was even like are you shouting treason, or like almost at that line of like, okay. And then he realized like, nope, gotta shut my mouth, because he's, I feel like, a very soft spoken, also the way he talks and his tone, very different than the behavior of a lot of other men that are a lot more assertive or aggressive or like matter of fact. And I mean, he states that as one of the most important reasons as to why him and Scarlett would never work, and that he would never make her fully happy. And that's why he wanted to marry Mel, because they were of the same soft-spoken nature, reserved, peaceful nature. And that's just so far different than what they thought, what a man should be in that time frame, especially a man that's going to war. And though I think really, if he had the choice, even if the war was going to happen, he wouldn't want to fight if given that choice. But I think he knew that as a man in that society at that time, especially in the South, the only way that you could stay honorable is if you go fight. And if not, one, you're a deserter if you try to leave and they'll kill you, or two, you might as well already be dead, because you're going to be ostracized for the rest of your life. And so will your family, even post you dying. So I think he's one of those other characters that maybe doesn't get as the same arc, or I feel like maybe attention, at least in the film. I haven't read the book, so I can't say that. But at least in the film, he doesn't get that same, I feel like, full attention of, he maybe doesn't need as much time as Scarlett to do the arc. But, he's not allowed to be his full self either, especially being a man in that time. Like, I know we often criticize like what being a woman is like in that time, or being obviously a slave, one of the worst position that you could be in that time. But I don't think it was, even being a white man, there were certain expectations and restrictions on that too, depending on what type of personality, professionalism, money, because he doesn't ultimately have that much money either. So I think that plays a part too of like maybe that queer perspective of like he's not what you would assume is the picturesque picture of like a Southern male at that time. I know he doesn't really, and I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think he really states an opinion on slavery, but I know that they were very much like very kind and caring, him and Mel, when it comes to like,
does, I believe, in the scene with the mill with Scarlet, he tries to call Scarlet out for using convict labor.
That's right.
And she says, well, you had no problem when you owned slaves. And he says, I would have freed them once my father died. If the war hadn't come already, I was planning on freeing them. So
there we go.
He does have this sense. And he was also like, well, you're also mistreating them. At least we treated our enslaved people. At least we treated them well. And It's also like, well, again, kind of that revisionist little bit of history of like, oh, well, people, like, we treated them well, they wanted to be there. Again, that very, like, I think that white perspective,
dangerous,
of someone who owned enslaved people. So that's the closest I think we get to his hot take on slavery in America.
That's fair. I feel like that's in part to, like you said, like his general upbringing. It probably wouldn't have been fully accepted or fully, for someone to fully imagine in that upbringing, like, yeah, we should just free them, period, and be fully passionate about it. I think that was very hard to do in that time sense, especially being a white male, because there's a lot of pressure to not, that you need them, one, and two, that's the way things should be. So, but yeah, I think he's a good perspective on that too.
And he also, like, I agree with what you said. I think he kind of goes against what we would typically think of as the quintessential male character, because he is very soft-spoken. He's very gentlemanly, and they go out of their way several times in the films to talk about that. That's why Scarlet is so attracted to him, is because he is so different from the other men. He does have kind of a cool head, and he also presents as pretty effeminate. Like, throughout the movie, he's very, like, the tone of his voice, he's very slender, very, very fair, especially when you compare him to Rhett Butler, who's, like, clearly supposed to be the opposite of him in every single way. He, like, again, like, he kind of steps out that traditional masculine role, and he does kind of go more into the effeminate, and he seems very out of place when he's kind of got that masculine energy. Like, even in that scene where he's pretending to be drunk like the rest of them, it's like, this ain't Ashley. Like, this, he's clearly not, like, this is not who he is. And when he's talking with the other men about the war, he does kind of want that, I just hope the Union lets us leave in peace. I hope that they just let us go. I hope that there's no war. I don't want to fight. Basically, without saying I don't want to fight. He's just, I think, trying to have a different perspective of, well, this could happen too. But yeah, no, he's an interesting take, because I also don't know if the film wants us to like Ashley or if the film doesn't want us to like Ashley. I think it depends on how you view. I think in part it's how you view Rhett Butler. I also think it's how you view Scarlet as well, like, depending on your perspective you take. I don't know. I don't know what the film's goal is. I'm ambivalent. I'm kind of on the fence, just because he doesn't really, I don't know. On this viewing, I couldn't really decide whether he was a character I liked or disliked. So I'm just going to play the Ashley card, and I will be in the middle. the Ashley Wilkes card, not Ashley our guest.
I appreciate, though, it's confusing. That's who I'm named after, but so maybe I should. But growing up, I think you're spot on with like, what does the film want us to think about each person? Because Rhett's on the front cover with Scarlet. So it's like immediately you're like, I'm rooting for you too. Yes,
He must be the hero.
Yeah. And then Ashley's like, oh, you're a weenie. Or like, why are you so soft? That's how I thought when I was younger. And now I'm like, oh, that's horrible. The poor man just doesn't want to go to war. He's just a nice man.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about some of our favorite scenes.
I was about to give, that was my initiative. That was my yes, let's go.
Gotcha. So yeah, let's move on to talk about some of our favorite scenes. So we'll start with our guest Ashley. So Ashley, tell us, what is your favorite scene or scenes that really stand out to you in this movie when you're watching it, that you're really excited to see on the screen?
I think some of my favorite scenes are definitely the ending stood out to me ever since I was younger. I feel like that's one of those that like is popularly like referenced in pop culture or other movies, TV shows. And sometimes I think to that degree, you're like, is it really that good? Or is it just, it's been passed down for so long, it's kind of accepted. But I think even as I've gotten older, I think it's still a favorite. I think in a different way. So like when I was younger, I thought the ending, one, obviously was sad because I was rooting for them to stay together, and that's not what happened when Rhett finally tells her off. And then when I watched it as a teenager, I started like noticing like just character flaws in general. So things weren't so romanticized to me as I started to grow up and understand the deeper meanings of not only the political tone, racial tone, but just also just characters have flaws, and I don't have to like all of them or solidly hate any of them. And then I started to realize like, oh, Scarlett's so not a role model, and Rhett's not that fabulous either. But in that moment, he had every right to kind of just put her in her place in terms of, you gotta stop, lady. You gotta. Because nobody really
is all of a sudden realizing that Melanie Wilkes is truly the hero to Gone with the Wind and the person to aspire to be.
Honestly, because I think up until that point too, everyone like was in eggshells, like stepping around Scarlet. Things were always said behind her back. That was the true opinion of how they felt towards her, not necessarily how she was all the time, but nobody would ever say that to her face. And I think in that moment was like, okay, you need to grow up a little bit. Like, you've been through some stuff, but that doesn't give you the right to treat people like crap all the time, especially because Rhett had his flaws, but, tried to help her grow up in a way. And I didn't see that when I was younger. So I thought that, especially like a man saying that to a woman in a film, especially from what I was used to watching with other classics, like that wasn't something that normally came up. Like, you could imagine like, okay, it was common, and I hate the word that it's common, but common for like, we see Scarlett slapping multiple people in the film. Okay. And it was like, yeah, like that's something that still happens in cinema. Like, you say something stupid, the woman's going to slap you, and we just accept it. And in that moment, it was like a verbal slap from a male to a female character. And so that always stood out to me of like, yeah, but just because you're a woman doesn't mean like you can also say and do whatever you want either, or threaten, or treat people like trash. Like, you're going to be told at some point you're not going to like it. And it just, to me, also like the whole marriage aspect too wasn't just like they were dating or they liked each other. They were married, they had a kid. So there was a lot of other things that played into it, but that's a heavy, I feel like, relationship arc, especially when you're at the time where you're starting to want or be interested in relationships. It's an important aspect to keep in mind of just treating people, one another, your partners, with respect. So I think that was truly pivotal for me. It's still one of my favorites. Obviously, the line is stellar. You can't do a better line than that. But I won't say it because I don't want to curse. But
I love that you presence that perspective, Ashley, of just because you've been through things doesn't mean you can treat people like crap. And I did, like, literally, as you said that was another connection that I made in my mind that's present in this film. And again, it really fits into that trauma survival narrative, because we can come out of trauma and we can grow and we can look back on it sometimes, and it sometimes makes us do things differently moving forward. Mm-hmm. We can also do the complete opposite, and we can treat people like crap because we've been treated like crap. Well, I've been hurt, so why can't other people get hurt? Or mm-hmm. why do I have to treat people kindly when I haven't been treated kindly? And in reality, like, when we have that perspective, it's not helpful. It doesn't really help the healing process. It just continues to inflict more pain. And I think that's what Scarlett does kind of towards the end of the movie, is she starts to drag people down with her.
Yep.
And because she's miserable, everyone else kind of has to be miserable as well. Rhett needs to be miserable. Melanie needs to be miserable. Ashley needs to be miserable. She is very focused on her own feelings. And I think it takes Melanie dying for her to realize that, oh crap, it's not all about me. There are other people in this. And I really did love her, and I really did care about her. And it's funny because we just watched a 4-hour-long movie in which you never actually said that to her. And
yeah,
it's interesting that it's coming out now. So I wanted just to shout out that I think that's a wonderful perspective to have, and that's a new one for me as well. Chris, your favorite scene in the movie, or scenes?
At first, growing up, I was always a fan of the getting ready for the barbecue scene when we see Scarlett getting ready. Honestly, I just wanted that dress, but because who doesn't want a big taffeta blue dress, a green dress that just, is frilled to the tons with different petticoats and laces and everything. But now, while I was watching the film, I guess my other favorite scene has to be the bazaar scene when after Rhett bids on Scarlet. And I do love me a good twirling in dresses scene, because I can't not look away, because anything can be fixed with a good twirl, and watching that whole scene, Rhett basically telling her, I'm gonna take you on dates. I'm gonna make you feel like the most important woman in the world. She's like, yeah, try, do it. I dare you, And then after he does all of these different, gives her these different gifts throughout that whole morning scenes, it goes to show how much Rhett honestly cared about her and how little she thought of him. She just said, oh, he's just another guy. I'm just going to fly away. That's not going to stay in my life. And she wanted stability. And at that moment during the bazaar scene, she took her own name and she kind of showed everyone, yeah, you think I'm in mourning? Haha, I'll show you.
Again, her trying to kind of break out of that box society's trying to put her into, because they're in the Victorian era, which is peak mourning culture, and she would have had to have been in black for at least a year.
There is
we're also in the age of post Queen Victoria mourning Prince Albert. And she was in mourning for the rest of her life. And that was the case for a lot of widows, where their husband would die and they were just in that for life. So for her to be at a party is shocking enough. Her dancing with a man, Aunt Pittypat's reaction was completely justified for a woman at that time, needing her smelling salts and being passed out. So again, her just kind of breaking out of this box of like, what is mourning supposed to be and what is expected of me as a woman. It's a very fantastic scene just to see Scarlet reacting in that way and Rhett kind of coaxing her out of it. So, and I think a scene that stands out to me, a couple of scenes stand out to me. I agree with Ashley on the ending scene. That really stands out to me every time I watch the movie. And on this particular rewatch, I started paying close attention to Scarlet right after she walks out of Melanie's room. And my eyes are just on Vivien Leigh for the remainder of the movie, because that's a turning point for her. And you kind of follow her on this journey of like these realizations that she's making. And then you start to see her world crumble again in this movie, because it crumbles a couple of times. Obviously, it crumbles when she gets back to Terra and she sees it completely torn up and looking very ragged. That's the first time her world collapses. This is the second time, I would say, her world collapses. And she's making these realizations. She says this line, "I've loved something that doesn't really exist." And that's a very poignant point for her. She's been chasing this dream. She's been chasing this hope. And she's finally realized, no, it's not going to make me happy, because this man doesn't love me after all. He's only been giving me the time of day because he's honorable. What have I done? I've wasted at least a decade of my life wanting this man who doesn't want me in the same way. He wanted this other woman. And she starts to unravel, and you can see her like desperately clinging to whatever she can salvage. She goes after Rhett. She's pleading with him. "I do love you. I do want to be with you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And he has that awesome comeback line of, "How childish are you to think that you can solve things with 'I'm sorry'?" It's just beautiful. It's beautifully acted by the two of them. Vivien Leigh really is a standout in this scene, just with like how she acts throughout it, how she acts with other people, how she acts by herself, walking back to the stairs. "I'll think about it tomorrow, but I have to think about it now." It's just a beautiful, beautiful ending scene. And the other scene that always stands out to me is the right before the intermission, the "As God is my witness, I'll never be hungry again." Again, your eyes are just fixed on her for that entire sequence and just seeing what she's doing, and you can't take your eyes off of her because you just don't know what she's going to do. Obviously, if you've seen the movie, you know what she does, but you're with her on that journey of how is she going to respond to this. Her whole family is asking her, "Well, what do you want us to do about this? Like, I can't take care of these sick people and the baby. I can't milk the cow. I can't do this. Oh, well, let's ask Mrs. O'Hara about this." Mrs. O'Hara is dead. She doesn't really have an opinion on the matter anymore. And she's just in this state walking out to the field. And that's when she makes the conclusion of, okay, I've lost everything. Like, this trauma has happened. Either I can live or I can die. And I'm choosing to live. And there is that desperation that is there and that hope. And it's just, again, just a beautifully acted scene. So there's so much good acting in this film to analyze, but Vivien Leigh really is a standout, and you can see how she got this part, and you can see how she beat out literally the hundreds of women who auditioned to be in this movie to be Scarlet. So those are the ones that stand out to me.
You know, as I was watching the ending scene last night, I got a very Hitchcockian feel from it. As she's running out in the mist, in the fog, it felt very much like Vertigo in a way, when they're walking up the church steps to the bell. And it felt very like as if we were viewing Scarlet's mind, but brought to life. She's walking around in this mist. That's what she was describing to Rhett in her dream. After they got married, she's like, "Oh, I've just been running around in the mist and I can't find it. Can you help me find it?" And that's what I think we're meant to see. Like, this is her dream come to life, her nightmare come to life. And I think that's really poignant for Vivien's acting to bring to a new light, because her way of portraying that whole I'm lost, where's my home, where can I find it? It's a very introspecting thing to view as an actor, as a viewer, as an audience member. It just brings a whole new gravitas to the film when you're watching that scene, when it comes full circle to that whole finale scene, and that moment when she's running around and she can't find Rhett, and she's trying to find the one person who she thinks will stand by her, ends up leaving her.
Absolutely. And I think time plays such a big role in this film, and the concept of time, and how people use their time in the film, specifically Scarlet. I noticed when we're at the Wilkes' plantation, there's a card of a clock, and there's a quote on it: do not squander time, that is the stuff life is made of. And squandering time is something that Scarlet really does in the movie. She really loses a lot of time. Again, she's convinced that Rhett is the one she loves. How much time did she lose with Rhett? And how did she spend her time being married to Rhett? How did she spend her time doing all of these things? She wanted something that wasn't there. And she doesn't really heed that warning. I don't know if she makes the best use of her time. Like, yeah, she builds her business and she acquires all this wealth. And what does she have at the end of it? She still feels hollow. She still is missing that which she truly wants. And throughout the entire film, she keeps saying, I'll think about it tomorrow. Whenever something bad happens, I'll think about it tomorrow. But tomorrow never comes. She never thinks about it. She never revisits it. She just goes from action to action to action without really thinking and reflecting. And at the end, it truly is, I think, the first time where she's making a more calculated decision. Everything else has kind of come natural to her. Even earlier in the film, like, she says something about, she has like this realization of like, oh, well, we'll plant more cotton. Cotton will skyrocket next year. And she makes these very business-minded decisions, or I'm going to buy the mill, or I'm going to go into the lumber business. And she does this almost instinctively without almost thinking about it. And now at the end of the film, she's genuinely confused about what she's going to do next. It's the first time it might be the first time, I don't have the script in front of me, where she's actually thinking about, well, what will I do next? What is going to be my next step? And she eventually reaches Tara, and it's like, I'll go back home. I'll take my time. I'll think about what I'll do, and I'll start over there. And now she's starting to reflect. Now she's starting to think about what's happened in the past. And again, it's just an interesting perspective to take about time. Ashley as well. I think he's the one who says the cause of living in the past is dying right in front of us. And he recognizes that it's time to move forward. Rhett realizes it's time to move forward. Everyone else has kind of accepted that, yeah, we need to do things differently. We can't just keep going on the way that things are. The people who refuse to accept it pretty much become irrelevant, or they end up dying. So, I don't know. I really do like how the film handles the concept of time and that theme kind of throughout the entire movie.
I think it also, to your point too, what you said earlier, Nate, like goes back to that like survival mode of just like, it's all reactive. You don't necessarily have time to plan. And so they don't have time to cope. They don't have time to, especially Scarlet, like, I don't have time to fall apart because all these people are falling apart around her. And I think that is another problem of like, when you look at like the servants and the slaves, like that's problematic of itself of like, they're in that way, it's like their own stupidity, or they don't know what to do. So they have to look to their masters for help. But in just the aspect of like Scarlet, she's just as frazzled. Like the mist is in and around her just as much as it is with everybody else. Cause obviously there's no guidebook for what's happening around them. There's no outline of like, well then just do this and that. She's also from that point, like with her education, I think her father probably with her, I feel like gave her a little more inside scope into things than he did with his other daughters, but she's not, trained to know what to do in this situation because she wasn't brought up as a man of like, here's how you review business matters and make smart business decisions. So she's going to do everything on the fly. So to her, I don't have time to fall apart. I don't have time to think about my feelings. I need to do what I need to do to survive. That kind of like, you see her eyes, like, and this is purely Vivien, but her eyes, I feel like, are like so expressive in that, you know, that like the switch has been flipped inside of her of like, I'm going to get through this and I don't care how I have to get through it. It's failure's not an option. So in that respect, in that determination, like that's, I think, how she succeeds, and she's super confident in those decisions, which I think is another testament to her being super fluid. She gains that confidence that no one really instilled in her before, and certainly not from societal norms instilling that in a female's position. And she just, I think that's when her true personality comes out. And she does, just in that sense, like you said, she never pre-planned for really what her true happiness would lie, where that would come from. So in that aspect, she doesn't succeed in that. And like you said, by the end of it, yeah, she's got all this money. She's in a better position in society. She finally got the man that she thought she wanted, that she didn't for a while. She tried the mom thing. And even prior to, you know, the daughter dying, she didn't really feel fulfilled at all with that. So she just goes back to her roots as far as like the time thing goes of like, well, when was I my happiest? At home in Tara. And so, but you see the determination come on her again, on her face of like, that will be my happiness, and that will be my pride in that sense. So I think another scene where that determination comes out, but it's in contrast because they're silhouetted, is if you notice the pregnancy with Mel, and she's having to go through that labor again, not knowing how the heck to do this because nobody's around to help her. The slave is, she had, and again, this problematic, said she had lied. She's like, I don't know why I lied. Yeah, probably because you were nervous and you didn't want to look stupid in front of her and get whipped for it, which either way she slaps her. And that was another like standout to me of like, whoa, I can't believe you just did that. Probably.
Because also Chrissy's supposed to be like 12. Like she is supposed to be like
right.
A child.
Yes.
And they obviously aged her up for the film. So you're depending on a 12-year-old to be honest to you about A, how to give like birth to a baby, and B, not be scared or be willing to go
like a doctor.
Yeah.
So I feel like, but in that like her attitude, like when they silhouette them in the room, and Mel's clearly in distress, which I feel like, God bless Mel, because that's not how I would be in that moment back then with no medication or whatsoever. But she's just like, oh, go ahead and scream. Nobody's here to hear you. I mean, like, that's amazing. You can just tell the tone. You don't even have to see her expression to know how determined she is of like, you're not going to die. The baby's not going to die. And I'm going to do this and it's going to happen. You're going to have this baby and you're going to be fine. And I just, that to me, the tone and the way they decided to silhouette that in the background with the impending Yankee soldiers coming into town, I think that was genius.
Hi, I'm Andrew Rimby, the host of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, a public humanities podcast where I interview writers, scholars, performers, and artists. Episodes air on Mondays.
And I'm married to Pippi, host of True Crime in Academia, an Ivory Tower Boiler Room podcast. True Crime in Academia is a true crime podcast focused on crimes committed by or to those in academia. Episodes air on Tuesdays.
Make sure you follow Ivory Tower Boiler Room
and True Crime in Academia
on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. Become a subscriber to get unedited video interviews and our merchandise at patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. When you're listening to our podcast episodes, imagine that you're in a cafe eavesdropping on our conversations. Enjoy.
All right, everyone. So we're back. Welcome back to our podcast on Old Gay Classic Cinema. We're back with Ashley. We're now going to discuss how the film holds up and what aspects we, as a queer audience, can take away from it. There are many aspects that we can take away from this film, but I believe the one thing that we must discuss that needs to be, that I believe has been put on the threshold many, many a times that we need to be held accountable for, is the quote-unquote act of slavery in this film. The way that it's depicted, the way that it's the way that it's shown is not in its respect a way that we're used to in our history books. We're used to believe that slavery was master and slave. We have the slave in chains. We have them in tattered clothing. With this film, their mental capacity is still in that aspect, but with the way that they're dressed, they're very well provided for. And I believe that it shows in this film. I think that's what they kind of wanted to show in this film, is that just because we're depicting slaves doesn't mean that we're depicting them the way that you believe that they're supposed to be depicted. So I wanted to get Nate's response on how this film holds up and what he takes away from it, especially in the slavery aspect. Nate?
Thank you, Chris. So obviously first, I will presence first and foremost that I am white, and that is my ethnic background. And again, like I said in the beginning of the episode, I've always grown up in the North. My family has pretty much always been up north. Either they fought for the Union if they were here for the Civil War, or they were not even here when the Civil War occurred. So this is my perspective, and obviously presencing that I have limited capacity to speak on this. And I think if we're asking the question if the film holds up or if it's gone with the wind, is the thing that holds up is a lot of the technical aspects of this film. This film has beautiful cinematography. The way that each scene is laid, it's set, it's framed, beautiful for storytelling and beautiful thematically. And the costumes, the intricate details of the costumes, the intricate details of the sets, the little things that you catch here and there. The fact that there's like a fairy tale scene in Bonnie's bedroom and stained glass of like a knight in shining armor and a castle, kind of representing that this is supposed to be Camelot in a way. This is supposed to be the ideal situation. It's just beautiful and it's breathtaking. The music is gorgeous and instantly recognizable. There's so many themes throughout this that if you heard it out and about, you would probably recognize it from the film. The acting, a masterclass. Beautiful examples of acting being reacting, the actors truly being in the moment and really truly understanding their characters. I don't think there's a single person that was miscast in this film. I think everyone was beautifully cast, and knowing who was around in 1939, I don't think anyone could have done any part better than those actors. I think they really did do a wonderful job casting those folks in those roles. That being said, what I feel doesn't hold up is obviously some of the more specific themes of this film. And the way I kind of conceptualize this and the way that I thought about it while I was watching this film is it is very representative of this idea of the Old South in its own way, because on the surface level of it, it is beautiful. It looks beautiful. The costumes are beautiful. The colors are beautiful. The Technicolor is gorgeous in this film. And on the surface, it seems to be, I'm going to use Melanie's words in the beginning of the movie, a world that only exists to be graceful and beautiful. And when you look deeper into it, it's not real life. It is not the reality of this time period. It is not the reality of the people who actually would have been living these experiences. And much like the Old South, I think the deeper you get into it and the reality of it, the less beautiful it becomes. And I think this film exists and it will continue to be a time capsule of how people, when the film was made, viewed the Civil War, maybe. And I think there was still trying to perpetuate this myth of, well, there are two sides to it. There were some enslaved folks who wanted to be there and like were treated well and they were better off because they were there. That's purely a myth. That's not based on any evidence that we have. That's not based on any reality that we have. They try to, I think, try to play the middle of the road because obviously they do, like, we're watching these people for 4 hours and they can't be complete villains, otherwise we have no empathy for any of them. So they're trying to play that middle of the road. They do have the Northerners in the film kind of portrayed as being villainous, and you have the overseer who gets a girl pregnant out of wedlock and then she loses the baby, or you have the man, the carpetbagger, talking about 40 acres and a mule to the recently freed people and showing them sort of like trying to be taking advantage of these poor people who are not smart enough to know that he's trying to swindle them or that he's selling them like false hope, because we also know that a lot of these people who were free did not get what was actually promised to them. And they did not get these things. So I think it tries to do these little winks and a nudge of like, well, yeah, no, both sides are kind of flawed, and kind of skirting around the realities of what slavery was and the horrors of it. And I think that's what this movie will eventually become, is it will become a time capsule. I don't think this is going to be a movie that continues to age gracefully. I think it already has not aged gracefully, and the wrinkles have been present for quite some time, and I think they're just going to continue to show. That's kind of how I view it from this 2022 lens. Do I think it's going to go away forever? I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if it really will ever go away forever, because even when the tragedy of George Floyd happened, HBO Max removed it from their streaming temporarily. And when they did that, it became like the top bought movie on like iTunes. And it was number 5 in the top 5 of Amazon. This film that has been around since 1939, all of a sudden shooting to the top of these things, these lists, when something like this happens. And I think that goes to show that this film will always have a life in some way. I don't know if it will always have a life for the right reasons, though. I don't know if people will be watching it just to appreciate the cinematography, the acting, the costumes, the sets. I'm very worried that the legacy of this film will be overshadowed by the darker themes of it. And I don't know if this will be a film that will be mandatory viewing forever. That is my thought. That is my perspective. Like I said, I have a limited perspective. That is what I personally feel having watched the movie. Is it will live on, but I don't know if it will live on for the right reasons. But what do you both think? I've been talking for a long time.
No, I think you captured that theme very eloquently with giving respect to all different aspects. I absolutely agree in terms of cinematography, the acting, the set design, costume design, the music. All of that is beautifully captured, beautifully done. I don't think anyone could have done any better, and I think that also serves to the aspect of not just the time period that they're covering and it being set in the Deep South. So, like you said, it's a perfect time capsule for that Deep South attitude towards the war, which you're right, growing up in the North, that's not really an attitude that we read a lot about. That's not how it's portrayed in history books. And to that aspect, it gives it a little humanity in terms of like it not feeling like such a foreign war that was held so long ago, because it is part of our past. And through different backgrounds and family, the different sides have been passed down and watered down through to the next generations. Like you mentioned, my family doesn't really have roots here during the Civil War, so that's not something that was rooted in our family, but we do see it, especially in 2022 and the years leading up to where we are now. It's a topic that keeps getting brought up in different ways through, I think we can agree, in some sort of traumatic generational experience further than passed down. To that aspect, I think what pushes it into a darker theme and overshadows, I think, not only just the tone of maybe, and how I tried to watch it when I was younger, growing up through high school and understanding the different tones that were surrounding all of that kind of history, was maybe not taking it so literally as I did when I was younger and just taking it as a literal, oh, this is a romantic war story. And it's not. There's other deeper layers I just couldn't fathom when I was younger, but just taking it for maybe not a literal sense and just as a portrayal of an attitude during a historically intense time frame in American history. So in that aspect, I hope that that time capsule stays and continues, and not necessarily people can appreciate it in that way, but it's not something that's pushed down and buried as shameful. What I think is shameful is what was happening in history at the time the movie came out. So obviously we know that it was kind of on the heels of, like, we've got World War II, and coming further out of the Great Depression, but a very depressing time frame again in American history. Also, I think not too long before, and I should have done research on it, but them actually going back and historically trying to catalog real life testaments from former slaves or from the families of former slaves was something that was more recent at that time this movie was coming out. So again, like you kind of mentioned, not really acknowledging the horrors of slavery. We just kind of started to attempt to do that. And especially in certain places of the country, that's not something that was an accepted attitude to even hear about. And so we've got segregation going on. Even though slavery is no longer an issue, we still have the downward spiral of the after effects and oppression, especially in the Deep South. And then we all know, with Mamie's character, the actress being in what we would consider more modern times than the time frame it's portraying, still being discriminated against because of her color, though she won an award for her brilliant acting, and albeit a character that, is portrayed in a very specific tone that wasn't accurate to how someone would have been in her position at that time or felt, but she portrayed it beautifully, and she definitely deserved the award. But I remember in the TCM mention that you noted, Nate, where they were giving that kind of intro into the background of the movie and the time frame that was going on with the movie. I remember they mentioned that in the room at the award show, she wasn't even permitted to sit with her co-stars. Even after accepting that award, she gave her speech. She was sat in the back of the room at a table by herself. I mean, that is what I think is more deplorable, because that's not excusable. Not saying slavery is excusable whatsoever, but the fact that they choose to do a film like this and have it portrayed already in a very controversial kind of attitude and glimpse into the past, but then further kind of just diminish any sort of, recognition or, use it to show notification, awareness of those horrors. They just completely decide not to take that opportunity, disregard it, and disregard not only her, but, imagine her winning an award, probably being one of the most notable Black actresses in that movie, what they would probably consider a notable role in that movie, in air quotes. But I can't imagine if that's how they treated her, how were others in that film treated? I mean, just the quotes alone with some of the things that they were they were quoted saying, as far as like them acting as slaves, like, you know, having to dig trenches in between the Yankee soldiers coming down and Atlanta's defense, but they were happy to do so. Obviously, that's an incorrect attitude, but just the fact of the climate that was centered after the movie coming out, being publicized, awards after the fact, just that I think is worse. And that's where I think a lot of the shame comes from, because you would have hoped at that point it would be more progressive, and it just wasn't. Just the attitudes even surrounding those that were in the film of a different color, which is upsetting.
And I think even the film, like I mentioned earlier in the episode, the film does try to sanitize in some way, shape, or form what happens in the book. They change the language. They also change a key aspect, and I want to presence this because this is something that's noticeably absent in the movie compared to the book. And I will say another way that this film stands out is I think any author would want their book to be as faithfully adapted as this film was, because they really kept everything in the story. The things that they really excluded were just things not really crucial to the plot, like Scarlett has 2 other kids before she has Bonnie. She has a kid from each marriage. They don't make the cut for the film. But one thing that is noticeably absent is the scene where Scarlett is attacked when she's going through the shanty town. In the book, she's actually attacked by a person of color. She's attacked by a black man. And the film changes it to being a white man. And in the book, it's not just a political meeting. It is a meeting of the KKK. Rhett, Ashley, Mr. Kennedy, Dr. Meade, they are all members of the KKK in the book.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and that's actually what is the political meeting. The film erases that and obviously changes it where Rhett's not even there. Rhett tries to break it up. But that is a key aspect of the book that is left out, because I think the film is trying to sort of be this middle ground, whereas the book was a lot less of a middle ground. And like, even then, the film still is glorifying these things and glamorizing it. They still sanitize in a way, shape, or form, because I think they were also, I don't know when the tide started to shift around the KKK, because obviously when the film The Birth of a Nation came out, I believe that was in the 20s. I think that was 1928, maybe like 10 years before this film came out. That led to a resurgence. So by this time, I don't know if that would have been widely accepted. So the film does try to sanitize this history even more so, of like that this is what this was, and they try to cover that up, which again shows us that they even knew at the time that this was wrong, this was not right, and that there's this skewed message going on here, and they didn't really do anything to combat it. Yes, we can highlight that Hattie McDaniel gets an Oscar for her role, and she's the first Black woman to win the Best Supporting Actress for award for the Oscars, but they noticeably don't do anything when she can't attend the Atlanta premiere because the theater is still segregated and it's white only. The only person who actually speaks up is Clark Gable, and Clark Gable basically said, I will not go to the premiere if she can't be there. And she basically told him to stand down, that he like needed to go, and that she was like willing to sit that out or whatever if she wasn't allowed to be there. But the producers don't do anything about it. MGM doesn't do anything about it. So they have an opportunity where they could have, I think, made this right, and they could have adapted it to maybe be not as faithful to the book, but also could have been more rooted in history. It wasn't. And we can also identify that this is a 2022 lens looking back. Like, if they were adapting Gone with the Wind today, A, I don't know if they would be adapting it, but B, it probably would have been closer to what history would have actually looked like, and the story would have been probably drastically changed. So, but this is 1939. And they still have to sell this movie of a very, very, very popular book that was a blockbuster of its day. And they couldn't really deviate from that. They were not striving to create a historical film with this. They were trying to make as much money as possible from this film. So, but yeah.
I think I could see them, if anything, if they did something in 2022, like you kind of were alluding to. I don't think it would be Gone with the Wind 2.0, but I could see them, which they've done with a lot of not controversial movies, but classic movies that had a lot of discrimination from different culture, ethnic, gender. What they've done now, it's like the making of a movie. So perhaps like the making of Gone with the Wind and everything kind of wrong surrounding how that process came about. And I'm not fully like aware of the entire process, so I can't say if from start to finish it was completely like discriminatory or unfair or anything like that. But just in terms of like, I know like the Mary Poppins movie that came out, like
Saving Mr. Banks.
Yes, thank you. Like, I know that was controversial, even just that coming out, because how dare they be anything bad said about like Disney in that aspect. And like, it's Mary Poppins, we all love Mary Poppins, but like, there's discrimination on that front with her being a woman. So I could see them doing something like that to then make a testament and like bringing awareness of like that was not done and handled the way it should have been.
Yeah. And I think I even said this when we were prepping for the episode. Like I could see a mini series based on Gone with the Wind where they try to make it a little bit more historically accurate. Like I'm thinking sort of along the lines of the Netflix and CBC show Anne with an E, where they take the story of Anne of Green Gables, but they base it a little bit more in the reality. Anne now has a more realistic, I think, approach to life based on her experiences. Yes, she has optimism and she has hope, but she is still a traumatized child. They incorporate other people who were present in Canada at that time, but are not really represented in the stories. They include people of color. They include First Nations people. They include those storylines in tandem with the white characters. I could see them maybe making this into a mini series where it's a little bit more based in the reality. The horrors of slavery may be a little bit more prevalent, maybe even giving more of a backstory to who Mammy is, who Prissy is, like what are their stories, who are these people. And I know that in recent years, I think there's even a book that has been written about like a potential, I don't know if it's authorized by Margaret Mitchell's estate, the author, but they did write a book about Mammy's perspective, and they did give her a name. I believe they call her Ruth, and they do try to tell the story through her eyes. I also don't know if that would ever be made in America. I don't know if America would be able to handle
to swallow that pill.
To swallow that. And I think they would say, like, how dare you mess with a classic? I could see like the BBC or somewhere like overseas maybe doing it. I don't see America being able to even contemplate this story being revised to be more realistic. So
I feel like if anything were to come from that, though, this would be a great time to really dig into that part of it, into that historical aspect or to that character background, because I mean, there are a lot more spotlights on now more accurately portraying Black history. And I think it's serving the portrayal and giving spotlight to those that would be either whitewashed, we never would have heard of these characters, these backgrounds, these stories, or some of them, we know that the stories have come from a certain place, but we've been led to believe that they originate somewhere else and the characters look different, act different. But now we're hearing from the origin points, which I think is really special.
I actually found a book. You just tell me there's a book, and I go full Lady Gaga on it. I found it's called Ruth's Journey, the authorized novel of Mammy from Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind by Donald McCaig, It came out in 2014, October 14, 2014. It's 400 pages.
Wow. Is that the same author who does Rhett Butler's People? Because that's the other authorized
Let me
sequel,
see.
prequel to Gone with the Wind.
I didn't even know these things existed. I think
There's another one, Scarlet, that was also made into a miniseries that did not
I
get
saw
such great
that.
reviews. That is a sequel.
Uh-oh.
And the Margaret Mitchell estate was not, well, so I'm going to say allegedly was not happy with it based on the author who wrote Rhett Butler's People, who did also work with the estate.
He was the author who wrote, yes, he was the author that wrote
Gotcha.
that. Yes.
So.
That came out in 2007. So Mammy's story came out in 2014. So, yeah.
I definitely would want to pick that up. And it would be interesting too, like, so the Mammy's supposed to be a prequel too?
Yes.
Or is it just
I think it's a prequel / like side midquel where it's like her journey before Gone with the Wind, and then
think of it as Wicked, and then you see it in Wicked, which
okay.
Like think of it like that.
I think that would be awesome.
That's my next. Both of those books are my next Amazon.
Yeah,
is for Christmas this year. Yep, there we go.
So, and obviously, like, we can talk about the problematic aspects of the film in terms of race. I think we also can highlight the very problematic aspects of the film as it relates to gender and romantic relationships. How this is definitely sold as a romance, and I'm curious to your y'all's thoughts watching this film in 2022. Do we consider this a romance still? Do we still see this as hashtag couple goals, or
hashtag no?
Tell us more, Chris. What's your perspective?
Well, from my perspective, this film is about the war and the casualties that went through that whole aspect, the trauma that ensued with it. There's no romantic aspect, and whether there is a romantic aspect, it's just completely derailed from what is going on in the present. Like they tried to maximize on Rhett and Scarlett's romance, and then they traveled to Scarlett and Ashley's romance, but that sidelined because Ashley could give a fig about Scarlett's wants and needs, and it's trying to be something that's not when it's talking about romance. When people try to classify it as a romantic film, it's not. It's a historical It's a historical film, something that is seen in documentaries that's about the Civil War. We see different clips from the film that are put in documentaries that are about like the times during that time, and there's no romantic aspect given throughout this whole film. Yes, of course, there's the marriages and the downfalls and the children and the everything, but there's no hint of romance that I can gather that is sweeping me off my feet that I don't feel in this film as a whole.
Ashley, what are your thoughts?
I think as I've gotten older, that has changed. If you were to ask me that, like, prior to me even being 16, I hands down would be like, of course it's a romance movie. Have you seen the front cover? But honestly, looking at it as you get older and rewatching, and then also, right, I think when you're younger, you're not really paying attention to the dialogue. You're paying attention to what do they look like, or what are their feelings? Are they kissing? Are they holding each other? And then obviously you've got the beautiful music in the background to help indicate, I think, to what you were alluding to earlier, Nate, like how you should be feeling, and like what are the colors and the lighting in the background. So that's what I had categorized as like my romantic cues for the movie and the film. But I mean, being an adult, even at 16, watching it and actually listening to the dialogue and kind of taking away, like you said, the glamorizing factors and taking those layers away, it's not a romance, because I don't think there's, to Chris's point, like a consistent real romance, except maybe if you're looking at it from their perspective of Ashley and Mel, but you don't really see their whole romantic aspects. So as you would with most romance films or like adaptations, they center around either a solid couple or a few solid couples. They may like maybe jump around or change up the partners, but you don't really see that except from Scarlett's view. You don't see Ashley and Mel's background romance. Like, how did they meet? How did they fall in love? you kind of just have to take their word for how they feel towards one another and why they feel that way. And you're just kind of put in the middle of Scarlett is obsessed with Ashley. We didn't really see a background of like, how did she become obsessed with him? What was her first experiences before Mel was in the picture of him? It's very superficial, her romances. And you start to see that as you get older. There's really no deep connection or love there. I think to that regard, Clark Gable and Vivien just had really great chemistry. So it makes you want for that romance to work and that it to be the romance of the movie. But I don't think it actually holds up in that regard. And like Chris said, I think it's more of a historical, I would say, drama for sure. With some of that sprinkled in, but only in the context of like what I feel like a normal person could handle at that time. And honestly, for a lot of it, being in survival mode, like romance is not a factor. Love is not a factor. She's not pining over Rhett when he goes to war and being like, I'm worried for him. Is he going to come back? It's just purely in a sense of security. And she'll just move on if he would have died, she would have just moved on to the next buddy who comes along that can give her something that she can not necessarily take advantage of, but spin into something profitable and secure. And there's no romance in that.
I wish I could see it back in time when like the book came out, if it was marketed as a romance, or was it marketed purely as like a historical drama? Because I believe the first edition cover, you really don't see much. It's the first cover, I believe, is just the words "Gone with the Wind," and then there's like a little itty bitty picture of Scarlet in her hoop skirt outside Tara, and that's all you see. You don't see anything with Rhett. It's not like the film where Vivien Leigh is draped over Clark Gable's arms, and they're like, and it's also a scene that I think never really happens in the film. The only thing I can think of like where she's in his arms like that is when he's literally taking her up the stairs to have his way with her, which is again another sanitized aspect of the film that is supposed to be in the book marital rape. Like, Scarlett is not consenting to this. This is not something that she wanted to be a part of. In the film, it shows her the next day and she's all dewy and happy and like, oh, this is just what I needed. And it's like, oh God, no, this is gross. This is not actually what it was meant to be.
And that's a theme I also noticed watching it. Not that I hadn't seen it sooner, but yes, that's the cover.
And I'm pretty sure that is the copy that I had in high school when I read it. I'm curious again.
Actually. Remember, we went to Barnes and Noble one day and with your mom, and you told me, oh, the paperback is much more cheaper than the hardcover, so you convinced me to buy this version of the book, and it still hasn't been read yet.
Same here. I've cracked it a couple of times, but it is a big
to like page 60.
Buckle up. There is a lot of. It is a long ride, and it gives you a lot of, I think, the questions that you have from the movie of like, why does Scarlett love Ashley so much? What is the aspect of Ashley and Mellie's relationship? Although we know the answer to how Ashley and Mellie met. They just met at a family reunion because that's what one does, I guess. But
I actually wanted to discuss a little bit about what you touched on, Nathaniel, about the quote unquote rape scene. As I was rewatching that scene, my first inclination was I wanted Scarlett's robe, Vivien's robe that she wears, the red
it's
robe.
A beautiful robe.
I want that.
Beautiful clothes, beautiful gowns.
That whole the whole way that the film is shot. You know what actually went? I don't know if you did a little research, but we have our old friend George Cukor, or as Emily calls her, Cukor.
George Cukor.
We have him and Victor Fleming. Now, Vivien loved George's kindness, his way of trying to get her to coax her to do a scene, whereas Victor
George is a baby
nonsense.
angel that needs to be protected at all costs.
Exactly. We love George Cukor. We love him. Although
Victor Fleming.
Yes, and then we have
Victor Fleming,
we have him being a no-nonsense Judy Garland slapping person who doesn't give a crap about anyone's acting preference. He just wants the scene to get done and doesn't take no one's shit for anything. I think Vivien preferred George rather than Victor because Victor treated her like some sort of pack mule. He just expected her to just become Scarlet and just do the work and get it done and not be able to ask questions, not to be asking questions, not to be lost my train of thought, but
kind of just shut up and do what I say.
Basically.
Just like perform.
Kind of like Rhett to Scarlet.
But that whole scene that I wanted to discuss was that whole rape scene in general was, do we think it's a rape scene? Is that what we're coming to? Is that
I feel like that's the assumption.
Right.
But I mean, I don't know. Is it portrayed differently in the book?
If I'm remembering, and like it's been a hot minute since I've read the book, but I think one of the criticisms of the film compared to the book is that the book really does portray it as marital rape and that Scarlet is not consenting to this.
Okay.
The film, I think, at best or at worst, I don't know if I'm phrasing this right, I think at like it's blurred because she's clearly resisting in the scene beforehand. She does not want this. The morning after, she seems happy that it happened. And she's like almost like confused as to why he's apologizing for it the morning after. And I think, again, it's the film making a deliberate choice to sanitize. Because they also had, they had to really, I think, save up their scandalousness for the dam that happens at the end of the movie. Because they probably had to fight tooth and nail to get that included in there. So they probably had to make sure this film was as squeaky clean as possible, which, again, you're watching the film. I think it still has a G rating on Amazon when you watch it. And I'm just like, I don't know if I would rate this as G.
It is. Even on iTunes, it's rated G.
Oh my gosh.
Meanwhile, Tangled, for reference, is PG. Because I'm pretty sure there's a fart joke in there. Yeah. But yeah, no, I think the film makes a very I think they make a choice to blur it. And I think we can at least see in the beginning there is no consent. It's the after that leaves it very what is happening here. Yeah, I don't know, maybe she changes her mind somewhere between the stairs and the bedroom. I don't think so, though. And yeah.
I don't think like that play on, the romance where the woman's resisting and the guy's trying to coax her, and then she gets angry and fights, but then it's it's supposed to end with it just don't talk to me or I'm mad at you, and then you forcibly grab her face and force a kiss on her, and she's supposed to melt in your arms type of dramatic romance.
Just needed a man to put me in my place.
Exactly. And
that's what I needed.
I think also earlier in the film, and I think when I was younger, I didn't want to see it because I just was so convinced they were meant to be. She was kind of resisting him the whole way through.
Oh, yeah.
And there was also, especially it stood out to me this past weekend, when he helps her leave Atlanta with Mel and the baby just being born, and was able to steal the cart and the horse for her, and then got her out of the city, and then eventually had changed his kind of mind on his feeling about the war, and he wants to then join up, and then just basically leaves her. And she's like, oh my God, you're just leaving me here? What the heck? You're supposed to essentially be my stability, and now you're going to leave me here all by myself with all these people to take care of. And he's giving the reasons why he wants to join up, which seemingly you're like, oh, maybe he's feeling bad, or he wants to be a hero. Yay, he's even better than what we thought. And then he's wanting her to give him a kiss goodbye because he doesn't know if he'll survive or not, or he'll see her again. And at first thought, you probably want to be yeah, give him a kiss. You don't know when you're going to see him or if he'll die. It'll be the last thing that you do. And she doesn't want to. She says no. She puts her arms up. He's trying to grab her, and he actually, I think, picks her up off the cart to forcefully put her on the ground in front of him and forces a kiss. and you wait for it. And I was like, even just watching just to wait, like, does she melt? Do they show her
She
melting?
doesn't.
She doesn't. And I
She does
think
not.
that's a testament to Vivien. I don't know. I can't 100% say that. I think that's a true testament to her character. She did not want to. She did not melt. She didn't feel bad. She didn't worry for his safety. She did not want that. Not what she wanted at all. So I feel like that's also a testament to, like, kind of that survivor mentality of then maybe she changes her mind, in air quotes, because he can provide her stability and security and they seemingly get along. But even just the wording of like how they are meant to be, in air quotes, because he gives the justification that they're the same person. And then he just further describes who they are, or who he thinks they are, basically telling her, mansplaining, this is who you are because it's very similar to me, and doesn't categorize himself as like a hero or that great of a person, and that they're shallow and such. And it's like, that's not romantic at all. You're basically telling me I'm a shitty person and that you are too, so we're meant to be. So in that aspect, I'm like, that is toxic.
Oh, yeah. So I think we're all on the same page here, is that this film definitely does not hold up as a romance movie, not the movie you want to maybe have a first date with someone and watch with them, unless you met at a family reunion like Melly and Ashley.
And your cousins,
Wilkes.
I guess.
Not our guest, Ashley. Ashley is not
Thank you.
dating her cousins. But yeah, no. So I think we're all kind of on this, like, the film does not hold up very well, and it does not age gracefully or as beautiful as it maybe would have liked to. I also don't think that was the intention when they made this movie. I don't think they were intending to create a movie that was supposed to stand up to the test of time. I think that happens later. I think history decides what films survive, what films get to be considered classics. As we're kind of concluding this episode, the final thought, I think, is this a film that should not be seen, or is this a film that should continue to be seen? Kind of, again, like, is this a film that gets #canceled? Is this a film that still gets to exist in the American film history, I guess?
You know, when you talk about American films, the films that came out, the two films that came out during that time period was Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. One of those films, both of these films have become icons and masterpieces in their own way, but I believe both of these films have two different categories. One, Oz, has to do with the feeling of hope, the feeling of acceptance, the feeling of being a part of something even though you're just a visitor in this world. Whereas the other one, the one Gone with the Wind, has a feeling of despair, has a feeling of, yes, this is the world that we live in, this is what has happened in history. But just because it's depicted that way doesn't mean that it's not a classic in its own right. And when we compare those two films, especially since that Wizard of Oz is going to be our next film that we will be talking about, we can pull back the curtain and see how both of these films have this resonance with audiences. And I think that's kind of why I believe this film is a sort of, what we've said during this episode, is in its own way a time capsule. It's going to stay under the ground, and it will then be revitalized during certain points of our lives. Whereas The Wizard of Oz, we can just put it on in the background as background noise, and we won't think anything of it. But when you watch a film as historic as, wouldn't say historic, as a sort of time bubble, as Gone with the Wind, you have to look at all the aspects of that film. You have to peel back the layers, and you have to see what it means to, one, be an American, two, understand the racism that comes with this film. And 3, see how it has held up during the subsequent years. It has been reissued, redone, restored in its own right. And you have to look at that aspect. You have to see the painstaking measures that everyone went through to make this film the way that it's supposed to be viewed as now. And of course, we see that the card at the beginning of the film. Yes, we know that it's a piece of time where at that time it wasn't really thought of as, oh, this is a racism film. This is a film that might offend other people. They just made that film. They made Gone with the Wind to signify a point in time, to show people, yes, we went through this horrific time during our lives, but we're trying to preserve that right. We're trying to preserve it in its own time capsule and have other people enjoy it in their own right.
Thank you, Chris. Ashley, what are your thoughts?
I'm a big proponent of like hating anything to be purely just canceled. And I get why certain things or certain people or whatnot are to a degree, especially if they, if there's no remorse shown or there's no growth that comes with whatever the problematic thing is. If there's no growth, nobody spotlights what was wrong with it, in and outside of the situation and the parties involved, I think, well, then there's no lesson learned. So in that respect, or if you're just simply glorifying it, obviously that's wrong. But I think with this, this film context is key. And I think you can look at it from so many different lenses. I would hate to see that completely be washed away. And not just all the work that was put into it, but I mean, I could also see this being utilized in like other film courses, and maybe it's something that is in a film course. I haven't taken one myself, but I could see this being at different levels or different themes in the film course. This could come up and tick a lot of those boxes, especially for that time period in history. So I think it should be watched. Definitely, maybe not at a G rating. Let's maybe move that up and have people watching it, like let's have the audience informed. So I really enjoyed what TCM did when having that little intro, even just that little summarization of the context and the climate around this movie coming out and afterwards, and a little bit sprinkled in of like the time period it covers. That at least is doing the justification and the maybe not true justice it deserves, but it's giving you the audience who maybe has never seen this seeing it for the first time, doesn't know the context. Maybe it's someone who's not an American and therefore they don't really read up on the Civil War. We're taught that in school. I think that gives it a nice contextual bubble to then understand and put yourself in that mindset of here's what you're kind of getting into, and just take that as further understanding when you're watching this in full. Because it's a 4-hour long movie. So it's something that I feel like definitely not just because of you sitting in the seat for that long, but you need to take, I think, mental breaks to digest. So you're not going to get everything on the first watch. Something that you need to rewatch. You can watch it with a different lens every time and learn something new. So I hate to see films like that be washed away or overshadowed, and that may not have been their intention when they made it, but it's certainly something that lessons can be learned from, not just the time frame it covers, but all of the other, injustice surrounding it in the time that it was brought to light, and the actors involved, not just their characters. So I feel like it shouldn't be canceled. I feel like it very much should still be watched. Just having that informed, like maybe that warning label, that's important. And I would hope that's something that would spur good discussion.
Yeah. And I agree with you both. I think this film can continue to exist with a big asterisk next to it. And I think that context, I like what you said, Ashley, is context is key. And I think we have to recognize the time in which this movie was made. I think we have to recognize the level of education that the folks making this movie had. And we've come I would like to think that we as a society have come a long way. I hope and I pray that that is the case. We have to keep that in mind. And it's like you said, I can see this film being a very good lesson in filmmaking. I think it's, again, the special effects alone are worth... we just don't see even special effects like that anymore. We just don't. And I think it's important to know the context in which that this is made, that this is clearly, it's historical fiction. And it is a very fictionalized version of our history as Americans. I also worry when, again, if we cancel if we cancel media, not the whole freedom of speech argument that people like to throw out there. I worry that if things get canceled and they supposedly disappear, that people start to ignore the reality of what happened. And not that people are going to forget slavery. We have to remember that there are a whole lot of people who still view the South this way, who still view the Civil War this way, that maybe don't even refer to it as the Civil War, but refer to it as the War of Northern Aggression. Yeah. And there's a basis for this. And I think if we were to delete this movie, it makes a lot less sense where we are now. And I'm not saying the film causes this. I'm saying that this very rose-tinted perception of the Old South is what is the forerunner, like the grandfather, the great-grandfather of the views that maybe we have today, in some areas of this country and some areas of the world as well. So I'm kind of in agreement with you both. I think it's a film that we can't just delete, because I think deleting it would be the same thing as saying that it never happened. And I don't think that this is the film that, again, people of color, Black people need to know that this happened in the history or whatever. I think it's a learning opportunity for white folks, the people who are very represented in this movie, of yeah, this is how maybe we viewed it, but this is not the way it actually happened. I say we as a white person, not that I'm agreeing with the film. I think it's at the point where we can disagree with a lot of the specific themes of the film, and we can still recognize that on a technical level, there are a lot of impressive techniques used in it. It's, again, like I said, it very much is like the Old South on the surface. It's very beautiful. And when you dig deeper, it is not so great. And it is very problematic. So I think, like I said, it exists and it has a big asterisk next to it that needs a lot of context, and I would hope would spur a lot of discussion and not just be viewed at face value, because certainly there's a place for films like that. There are lots of films that we don't just watch for entertainment purposes. There are films that we watch and they lead to a commentary and a dialogue. So yeah, awesome.
Well, thank you both for having me. I love this. This was awesome.
Thank you for joining us.
I look forward to listening to more episodes and maybe being on a future one. Very excited to see how this develops.
Right. Awesome. Well, thank you, Chris, for having me here as well. And we will see. Well, we'll talk to our audiences in our next episode, which will, like Chris said, be featuring the classic 1939 film, another 1939 film, The Wizard of Oz, which is one of our favorites, and we'll have quite a few guests who will be on to share their experiences with it as well. All right, so until next time.